Hello, art historians, and welcome to our first lecture of Unit 8, where we're going to begin with our first ism. So there's going to be a lot of isms in this unit, but we're starting off with our first ism, which is Neoclassicism, or the New Classicism. And I like to call this the art of reason, and it is a direct response to the Rococo that is going to come right before it. And so as you can imagine, Neoclassicism is going to begin in France, in kind of a direct response to the events that inspired Rococo art. So let's start by establishing a little bit of context, all right? So one of the big things that has happened in the 1600s is going to be the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution is going to start to reveal through the work of people like Galileo and Isaac Newton that there are things that can be explained rationality, like in a rational way, instead of just explaining them through belief or religion and basically relying on the church for answers. Galileo proved using visual evidence that the sun was the center of the universe. Newton proved that there are forces of nature, things that just naturally happen, like gravity and inertia, that can also make things happen. So we start to see people apply those ideas of rationality and reason and doing things for a good reason that makes sense rather than on tradition and religion. We start to see that in the 1700s with the age of Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is where philosophers started to apply those laws of nature that people, for example, are all born naturally the same. They are all born with these natural rights and they are naturally the same. And it's not until society or governments says that they're different that they become different. So for example, no matter what our skin color or what our gender or whatever, we're all born the same. We're not different until society says that we're not, or governments, which are man-made, tell us that we're not. So this Enlightenment was all about, and it's going to be a very big movement in the mid-1700s, around 1750, which is where Neoclassicism starts, that we start to see these ideas of questioning things like, should there be absolute rulers? Should kings have absolute power over their kingdoms? If they're claiming that God gave them that right, where is the proof? Where is the evidence? And that kings and any kind of ruler should have their power from the people. So it's kind of like this idea of the social contract, that humans give up their ability to make decisions about their lives in exchange for an orderly government. So these ideas of the Enlightenment are going to be the big things that inspire revolutions. And when we're talking about revolutions, we're talking about major changes that are going to take place. And we're going to see those ideas inspire the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Haiti has a revolution, so do Latin American colonies, where people start to question the way that things have always been done, which has always been kind of done because a king says so or God says so. So our big contextual event for Neoclassicism is going to be the Enlightenment for sure. All right, so kind of this idea is the only way for us to become great or even inimitable if possible is to imitate the Greeks. So the Enlightenment was kind of this idea of, yes, the Greeks were rational. Right? They explained things. It's why the Greeks are the first people to do philosophy and science and mathematics, because they were giving explanations that weren't necessarily caused by the gods. Did they worship the gods? Yes, we have a lot of evidence for that. But they were also very big on, explaining things in a rational way. So for example, the Greeks saying that we get sick because the fluids in our body or our humors are out of whack. That's not God caused. That's a natural thing. So the Enlightenment philosophers are like, yes, we have to think rationally like the Greeks, but we need to go further and go beyond that. And we can't just stay with what they came up with. We need to progress further. So for example, the Greeks thought that the sun might be the center of the universe, but they never proved it and did anything with that knowledge. Now, after the scientific revolution and with the Enlightenment, it's let's see if we can go beyond the Greeks and the Romans, but we do need to think like the Greeks and the Romans and remember the rational past. Right, so for example, this work of art right here, which is on the 250, is a philosopher giving a lecture at the Orrery, right? And it's actually going to be in England, because this is Joseph Wright of Derby, who had studied in Italy and learned art. You can obviously see that the Baroque has made its way to England because we've got that tenebrism. We've got that really dramatic light that is being used. that is definitely Baroque, and it's a very candid theatrical moment. But you'll notice that this is not a religious scene. And in Italy, the Baroque was used for religious scenes. That's what that lighting was for this miraculous light of God. Well, this is not. This is, however, this light of understanding, this light of illuminating people's minds. And you can see like it's illuminating their faces of understanding. It's illuminating that light is really focusing on their foreheads and their faces and their contemplation. And this lecturer is standing here giving this lesson at an orrery, which is kind of like a model of the planets and the solar system and how all that works. And through studying this rationally, and by, having this lecture, not in a church, but in a educational setting and taking notes, and it's illuminating the light of these children, like they're learning this too. It's the light of learning, not necessarily a spiritual light, but it's illuminating us and literally enlightening us with knowledge. So Joseph Wright of Derby is going to be a major English painter, but he has been trained in Italy and really shows that the Baroque has made its way to England, because you can see here that tenebrism that we got from Caravaggio. And what I really like about Joseph Wright of Derby is because he's English, he kind of thumbs his nose at the French a little bit. And the French and their Royal Academy really had this belief that the only things really worthy of painting were from history, that they needed to be from the past, either biblical or Greco-Roman or classical or something like that, or, a event from French history, but not anything modern. Joseph Wright of Derby did not believe in that. He believed that modern events were just as worthy of being painted as past events. And so here we see an artist who is not painting a portrait of somebody living, he's painting a modern scene. He's showing history in the making, instead of just focusing on the past. And it's taking those Baroque techniques and using it for a whole different meaning and interpretation. But it's really about conversions of learning and enlightening in terms of understanding, and not the spiritual. It's moving away from that a little bit. And we can also see this in the work of Fruit and Insects by Rachel Roish. And the intelligent art historian like you may realize that this probably needs to be in Northern Europe. So we have the Baroque lighting technique. We have the incredible amount of naturalism and the fact that there's this awesome amount of detail in the bird's nest and the reflection off the grapes and all of these things. And if you're thinking that it's probably got a little bit of a symbolic religious meaning behind it, like the Vanitas that we've seen before, that all things rot and all things die, you'd actually be a little bit off, because this is the Enlightenment. And number one, this is Rachel Roish. This is a female artist, which we haven't really seen a lot of. And that's an Enlightenment idea, that females can be just as important as males. And we also are seeing this idea of, this is a botanical work. She's doing a still life, which was very popular in Northern Europe, because remember, they were more Protestant. They're moving away from the religious scenes. But it really is a scientific work of art to document different fruits and plants and bugs. So Rachel Roish, I just really think that she's cool. Her father was a famous botanist and anatomist. All right, so he's a scientist. And she would work with him in his work to do paintings of the things that he was, observing. So she was very, very focused on getting as much natural detail as possible, and she's incredibly good at getting microscopic detail. For example, with brushes that have just maybe one piece of hair on it. And in Holland, you have this area that is Protestant. So these are patrons and artists who are going to want things that aren't necessarily going to be religious. But they do want to spend their money on artwork. So there was a demand for things like still lifes and John Racine's, like things like, Vermeer did. But what she was doing was in microscopic, naturalistic detail, documenting her father's work. Now, people tried to read into this vanitas, that theme of all things must die, all things beautiful will fade, don't worry about the material world because it's going to go away. But really, this was she's an Enlightenment painter. She's painting for science, for observation, for documentation. And she was able to do it because it was a still life. And in the realm of women, even though we're enlightened, it's still not quite. This was an acceptable thing for women to paint is still lifes. That was okay for them. Painting china, painting flowers, painting fruits. That's okay. Like, look at the amount of detail she even gets in the pomegranate and like the different dust levels on the grapes that have been picked and the little details on the snake slithering through there and the shadow on the eggs. She's got Baroque technique, she's got incredible naturalism, but she's not really necessarily doing it for a religious theme or a moral thing as we've seen before. She's documenting in the interest of science. Now, unfortunately, I just wanted to zoom in and you can see the detail of like the little grasshopper and just how incredible the detail of the wings are and things that she did. For Rachel Broish, because she was working for her father, it was acceptable what she was doing, but it's still kind of considered to be a hobby and not really necessarily her profession. She's just kind of dabbling in it, like, isn't that precious, but not really so much like, oh, wow, she's an accomplished artist. So women are having kind of a different time during the Enlightenment because there are a lot of philosophers who are starting to say that women are important in their own right and that women should have rights and professions. But you're still living in a male-dominated world where they may feel very threatened by a woman. And one of the main areas that a woman could be an intellectual and be proud of that and really get involved in science and philosophy without having to worry about being kept down by a man was to enter the church. And so during this time, you can see that this is how nuns were kind of portrayed. Women who devoted their life to the church, they could take a vow of celibacy, not get married, and just focus instead on their, academic and spiritual pursuits. But you'll notice that the women are shown very demure. They're not really directingly looking at you with their gaze. They're kind of, really just kind of there. Like, it's just kind of documenting them, but not letting them engage you in a threatening manner. So I'm going to show you this video clip real quick on History's Worst Nun, who is a woman who, even though the Enlightenment had kind of made its way to Latin America, because she is in Latin America, it hadn't fully gotten here. It was still very much a man's world, and she's going to be kind of a threat to that. Okay, so on the 250, they have given you this work of art right here, and this is, as you can imagine, a portrait of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And this was actually created posthumously, so it was done for her after her death, because today she's honored in Mexico when the Enlightenment kind of finally caught up to Latin America, and it was kind of understood that she was an incredible woman rather than just a sinner, because all the way across the ocean, the Enlightenment hadn't gotten there whenever Sor Juana was around. And so as a result, she was seen as a threat to the church, a threat to patriarchy. And even though she was in the church, she was still seen as a threat. So this painting was done about the time that the Enlightenment finally caught up over here and started to show that this woman was somebody to be revered and honored. And you saw in the video that she's even on one of their, currency bills today, that she is honored as a part of their culture. So you can see here that it's got that Baroque technique to it, naturalism, little bit of lighting, which of course made its way over from Spain. She's wearing that huge medallion on her chest, which has Mary on it at the moment of the Annunciation when she finds out she's going to be pregnant with Jesus. Jesus, she's going to have the Son of God. And so that kind of shows her order that she was in. So she's very proudly a nun. She's very religious. She has her hands on a rosary that is very, very long. It's a set of prayer beads that's wrapped around her body. She has a cross on her shoulder. She's wearing her nun's habit. But then her right hand is on a book, and it's kind of showing that she could be both, that these two things can coexist. They don't have to necessarily be intertwined. They can coexist together, and that one doesn't hurt the other. And she's surrounded by books the way that men typically were shown, like Saint Jerome, who is typically shown surrounded by books, who was the patron of the order that she was in. So it's really like this effort by this Spanish artist to show that she is revered now. Like the Enlightenment had caught up when this was done after her death. So it's done by Miguel Cabrera, who is a Native American, or not a Native American, but he's an American artist in Latin America. And she's considered to be the first American feminist. And we're saying, notice between North and South America, there's no distinction. Like in America, she's the first true feminist, and she was born a Creole, which means that her status was a little bit lower, not only because she was a woman, but because her parents weren't born in Spain. That was just a geographical distinction that they made. So it's kind of showing that she refused to back down from who she was. Like she was an artist and a poet and an intellectual, and she was not going to give that up. So they honor her for that, even in her death. Now, you can imagine that with a big event like the Enlightenment, there's going to be an art movement that goes with it. And Neoclassicism is going to be that movement, because we're talking about a new use of classical art and architecture. So in the Renaissance, we do see, for example, the David is the first freestanding contrapposto bronze statue since Greece and Rome. So we're seeing them copying and bringing that back. But in Neoclassicism, there's a meaning for it. If they use Greek architecture or Roman architecture, or they use a specific scene from the classical stories, there's a reason for it. It's a new use, a new use of the classics in the past. And one of the things that's really going to kick that up and really help with the Enlightenment a little bit is in 1738 in Italy, they uncover Pompeii and Herculaneum, where we have seen the House of the Veti and the House of the Faun, and we looked at that last semester. And when they did this, all of a sudden Greek and Roman art and architecture became this fad because they uncovered so many wonderful resources. So along with the Enlightenment, we're going to see them use Greek and Roman art and architecture because the Greeks and the Romans were all about rational thought. So that is what we're going to see, and it is kind of this representation of rational thought through the art and architecture. So we know that the large amount of the Enlightenment is going to be done through philosophers. All right, so the philosophers, some of them are going to be French, some of them are going to be English, but they all kind of had the same idea, and that is stop making decisions about government and society and social classes and women and slavery based on because we've always done it, or tradition, or belief. We have got to take religion out of it and be rational and think about things that make sense. So for example, Voltaire in France, he'd been thrown in jail a couple times for running his mouth. He wanted freedom of speech. He wanted separation of church and state. He wanted fair trials. John Locke from England believed that humans were naturally born good and only became bad after bad experiences were written on them. And therefore, as good humans, they could create and run their own government, kind of the idea of a democracy. And his ideas are going to be very inspiring for the American Revolution, that if a government does not support your rights, you should abolish it, all right, and change it. Baron de Montesquieu was big into we should have separate branches of government instead of just one. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed there should be a contract, a social contract between the people and the government, that the people give the government its powers and say what power it has, and in exchange, they get a good government run for them. But one of the ideas is this replaced to art, is this idea of didactic art. And these guys did have an opinion on art, that it should be educating, that it should be didactic in nature. It should be to teach a lesson, to tell something through the story or moral or whatever that they're showing. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So, for example, on the left is Neoclassicism, and you can see that they've basically put Jesus and the Old Testament in a toga, and they put him in front of a building. So kind of this idea of that the Greeks are rational because that's a Greek style temple, and rationality and religion can coexist. So there's a reason for why they're putting the Greek architecture in there, and that is because of reason and rationality. The Neoclassicists hate the Rococo. They hate it because to them, the Rococo is too fuzzy, literally and figuratively, and how it looks, it's too hazy. It's not clear. Neoclassical is very clear, very dark outlines, very clear details, very clear brushwork, not, hazy brushwork, so that way the message is clear. All right, clear paint, clear message. They want people to understand what they're saying. They don't like that it's about frivolousness, about luxury, about flaunting social classes, which they think are man-made. It's airheaded bubble candy stuff, and they don't like it. So Neoclassicism is going to be the complete opposite of Rococo. It completely rejects Rococo. They like Baroque lighting. Right, so they like Baroque naturalism and lighting, but Baroque content they don't necessarily like. It's too dramatic, it's too emotional. Neoclassicists want to be cerebral. They want it to be thoughtful and intellectual and not dramatic or over the top or, unnecessary. Baroque was, theatrical. They don't want theatrical. They don't want you to feel, they want you to think. Rococo is too candy and fuzzy and hazy and not enough substance. So Neoclassicists reflect those ideas of the Enlightenment. They like old school. They like tradition, order, balance, these ideas of it's not necessarily what's good for the person, but also what's good for the state. I mean, it is these very intellectual ideas. There's always a lot of thought behind it, all right? So what these guys believe is that humans are humans. We are naturally a certain way. As human beings, we're like animals, and art should give people a chance to think about who we are as people and maybe aspire to something higher. So to think about what we are, what we could be. They are simple. They don't like over the top, not theatrical. It's a little bit idealized, right? So a little bit of, but it's not so much perfect in how it looks, but like a perfect world, really. So it's like the content is idealized of this is how it should be. So it's not so much how it should look, but how things should be. And they made a big mistake because neoclassicists like to do everything in white marble. They thought that represent very clear intent, very clear thoughts, very simple, when actually we know the Greeks painted almost everything that they did. So they kind of got that wrong. But they thought they were doing what the Greeks did because by the time they saw the Greek stuff, the paint had already chipped off of it. So they thought it was supposed to be marble. But ultimately, it's about should. What should we do? What is the right thing to do? What is the right way to be as humans or as a government or people? And it's didactic. It's to teach and to improve society, not just celebrate it like Rococo does. So one thing about neoclassical artwork is that it's intended to be public. Rococo is very private. The church likes to kind of keep Baroque to themselves to kind of encourage people to come into the church. That's not really the case, because you're not going to learn anything from neoclassicism if it's not public. So neoclassical was meant to be seen by the people on buildings, in museums, where people could see it and understand values like patriotism or courage or being a good moral person. And we're going to see this Enlightenment. It's with the Enlightenment we really start to see them push for those ideas of the Greek democracy and the Roman Republic, as they get really tired of the absolute rule of kings that's based on divine right or because God said so. So we see them referencing Greek ideas, Greek democracy, and things of that nature, which is why we have George Washington here shown in the U.S. Capitol building, sitting basically surrounded by Greek gods and goddesses, kind of, shown that he is, the symbol of Greek democracy. Okay, so one of the best ways that I can show you that neoclassical uses classical Greek and Roman architecture and art for a new purpose, not just to copy it, but to send a message, is the fact that in the United States, which 1776, we, have our Declaration of Independence, and, we have our Revolutionary War, which we actually declared before we declared independence, but whatever. So one of the reasons why during this time is our country was developed around the time of the Enlightenment. Our Constitution is based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, which are rational and separate religion and government and are based on rational thought. So when we created our government buildings, because we were modeling our government off of ancient Greek democracy and the Roman Republic, we have here a Greek temple front that looks like the Parthenon. And then we also have the Roman dome on the top that actually looks like Michelangelo's dome from the Vatican. So the whole idea here is there's a meaning, there's a reason why we're using Greek and Roman architecture. It's not just to copy it or to revive it. It's because this new classicism, there's a deeper meaning to it, that our government is based on rational thought. In fact, in front of some of our government buildings, we have statues of Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. So for example, Liberty or Justice, who is blind. And that's kind of this idea that, look, we're not even combining Christianity with our government. We're actually, using government principles from someplace that we don't even believe in their gods. So there's a whole reason for why they did this. And you can even kind of see that neoclassical furniture was based on kind of like the lounges. Like, so on the left, you have like Roman birds, and on the right, you have these lounges, kind of like we've seen in the Tomb of the Triclinium or the Sarcophagus of the Spouses, if you were with us first semester. And you can kind of see here that they're bringing back even the furniture that you would have seen in ancient Rome and ancient Greece to decorate homes. So one thing that we need to look at in how the form of how neoclassical artwork is going to be made is it is very, very clearly drawn, very well outlined, very precise. The brush strokes are intended not to be seen. It's, trying to make it look as clear as perfect, like polished, looking extremely clear. So that way the message is clear, because you don't want it hazy or fuzzy like it's a dream world or it's got kind of a, ambivalent look to it. It's a very clear message, because these were meant to be moral and didactic and teaching, and not just to be looked at or be kind of dreamy. You'll see in terms of content that there might be Greco-Roman architecture in it, so classical architecture, or there might be classical gods or goddesses, or there might be none of those things, but it might reference a story from Greece or Rome for a particular reason. And if Rococo and Baroque are kind of asymmetrical and dramatic and kind of moving, this is that idea of rationality, symmetry, balance, straight lines, nothing, it's meant to be very straight-laced. Like, this is meant to be a teaching tool, not something to be admired for being beautiful or twisty or curvy or anything like that. And the French Royal Academy, because this is where neoclassicism is going to develop, kind of helps set this standard, because if you're going to do that, they like to see, kind of unlike England, who is starting to do contemporary or modern history, these guys were all about the scenes that need to be shown are biblical past, historical past, or classical past. So neoclassical artists are going to paint in modern style. So there will be Baroque lighting. There will be very, very awesome naturalism, the same thing we saw in Baroque. We'll see Renaissance techniques of linear perspective. You know, they're painting in modern ways. And the whole point of this being neoclassical is they are using the past for a reason. There's a metaphor. There's a reason they chose that Greek god, that Roman story, that type of architecture to have in their work of art because it gives it a deeper meaning, right? It has more meaning because it's from the past. It's not just copying the past or reviving the past. So, for example, why did the United States in our government buildings and why do we still do this? And in fact, there's actually a push right now for government buildings to be less modern and less post-classical and instead return to kind of those classical roots. Why would our country's government buildings have Greco-Roman architecture? Well, democracy, rationalism, and domes, all going back to, you know, the Roman Republic. This is a really good example. This is Napoleon. All right, so Napoleon's going to be around in the late 1700s. That's when he really has his moment. But Napoleon wanted himself to be shown as Mars the peacekeeper. So why would Napoleon want to be shown as this Roman god? Well, number one, Napoleon's from Italy. He's trying to revive the Roman Empire. So there's a point of that. And he's a military general, but he's trying to send the message that, like Mars, he is a god of war, but he's using it in a way to actually bring peace through battle, to bring peace to France, to bring it to Europe. His sister, on the other hand, who was quite the, she was a little bit of a tramp, just a little bit. He was trying to marry her off to this duke, Napoleon was, to kind of create some alliances through marrying his sisters off. And he wanted a sculpture made of her. And she was originally supposed to be shown as Diana, like the goddess of the hunt and wisdom and, you know, a very strong woman. But instead, Pauline decided to be shown as Aphrodite, and she's got a Roman-style hairstyle. She's laying on a marble Roman-style sarcophagus. She has that wet drapery look around her, and she's shown, Pauline Borghese is shown as Venus because that's the goddess of love, and that's what she wanted to be shown as. Plus, it allowed her to be sculpted topless instead of wearing like a hunting dress. So she chose this goddess because it gave greater meaning to her and who she was. In terms of what we're going to see in subjects that neoclassical artists are going to paint, heroes, stories that tend to send a message. So, for example, David does one of Socrates whenever he's committing suicide because he was told that he could either pay 30 pieces of silver or he could drink hemlock as punishment for corrupting the minds of people. And he does this painting of, you know, Socrates basically on his deathbed saying what a mistake this is. And it's the whole idea of this is irrational. Like this does not make sense. So they're going to pick things from the past and they can be put in a modern setting because we've been doing that for a while. But the whole idea is that you're using these things from the past to send a message or teach a lesson. And a very common theme is going to be the exemplum virtutis, which is a virtuous example. Like you have characters within the painting or the statue that set a good moral example through their actions, whether that's an ancient story or a modern story put in a classical setting. The people generally aren't, if you see it in Rococo or Baroque, in terms of content, you're not going to see it in neoclassical. It's not dramatic. It's not theatrical. It's stern. Maybe sometimes it's sad, but on the other hand, it's still, there's a purpose for that emotion. It tells a story. It teaches a message. And the Greeks and Romans didn't have monarchs, even though the Romans technically had an empire. And that's kind of what these places, especially France, who's going to be kind of rebelling against the king a little bit, that's what they're going for. They're kind of trying to bring those ideas of the Greeks and the Romans of self-government. This is Napoleon. And you'll notice that, yes, he is shown in a modern style robe. He's got velvet. You can very clearly see that on. So he's wealthy. But he's wearing a Roman style crown of laurel leaves. And that's a classical reference to victory. So kind of showing his ambition of being the next Roman emperor, essentially. So Edgar Allan Poe actually gave a really good quote about neoclassicism, that it's the glory that was Greece And so like the glory of their ideas and their successes, but the grandeur that was Rome, because Rome was very big in their architecture and big in their ideas. So this kind of combined that. And places like England and France, places that are kind of challenging the governments that they have, this was a visual way to show this architecture or this art by using Greek and Roman showed what they wanted. They wanted reason, civic duty. It's not about you, it's about us. The ideas of republic and democracy and self-rule, all these things, these ideas that were part of the Enlightenment. And because those ideas were rooted in the classical ideas of Greece and Rome, the art and architecture shows that. I just really like this artist. This is Giovanni Panini, and Panini's one of my favorite artists. I love his work. But Panini, what he did is he would do paintings in this time period of the classical past. So like he's painting the Colosseum and the Pantheon and the Arch of Constantine and the inside of the Pantheon and the Constantina and all these really, you've got Laocoon and his sons over here on the right and these sarcophagi and dying Gaul down here at the bottom. Like basically showing that they are reviving the art because they're also reviving the ideas that went with it. This is another Panini, very, very well done. Great job with the perspective of the inside of the Pantheon. And the inside of St. Peter's Basilica. You can see Bernini's Baldacchino down here at the end. Another one outside the Colosseum. You've got the Column of Trajan, right? So we're going to stop here and we're going to pick up next with how this neoclassical movement really got started in France as a pushback against the Rococo style.